So welcome everyone to Ecopsychology Voices, an interview series with some of ecopsychology's luminaries. Hello, my name is Carol Koziel and I'm the founder of the Canadian Ecopsychology Network, the host of this series. Linda Bazal and I co-created this program. Today we have a very special presentation from Dr. Andy Fisher about the history of ecopsychology and the ecopsychology of history. Most of us know Andy as the author of the groundbreaking textbook, Radical Ecopsychology, Psychology in the Service of Life. Andy has worked for 20 years as a psychotherapist, but closed his practice this spring to focus more on his work as a scholar and educator. Instead of a writer in residence, thanks to the pandemic, Andy now refers to himself as a scholar in my own residence. Currently, Andy is working on another book to help launch a third generation of ecopsychology. Andy, thank you so much for sharing your time and wisdom with us today, and I'll turn the airwaves over to you.
Okay, well, thanks, Carol, and hello, everyone. So I'm going to be speaking today about history, so I think it's especially important to start by recognizing the history of colonialism, and to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from unceded traditional Omami Wanini or Algonquin territory. And I'm going to be discussing today the idea of a third generation of ecopsychology that I think has been emerging for the last few years, and I'm trying to get behind. And I think this latest generation of the field has a lot to do with speaking truth about colonialism. So it's always good to start this way. So today I'm going to talk about the history of ecopsychology, which is a topic that really forces us to think about, what ecopsychology is in the first place. If we're going to tell a history about something, we have how to recognize it. So in this sense, what we can speak to or point to most easily is the increasing use of this word ecopsych in the early to mid 1990s. I mean, the term predated it, but that was the era where it really sort of came into a larger awareness. But what I also want to do today is to discuss the flip side of the history of ecopsychology, which is the ecopsychology of history, which means looking at history itself as an ecopsychological process involving changes in the way that humans relate to nature, to use these clumsy terms. And I want to do this both to complexify the story that we tell about this field, and also to develop, support the development of this third generation that I think now is sort of gathering for more of a kind of full-out launch. That's my hope. So in other words, I want to talk about not just where ecopsychology is being, but also where it's going. So hopefully that's interesting. But before starting, I do want to add a note of caution about the dangers of discussing history, this kind of exercise. So first, there's nothing neutral about history telling. It's always a process of selection. It's always a process of interpretation. And there's always a question of whose history is being told, who's telling it, like me today, with what interests. So the history could always be told differently, and and I want it to be told differently. That's sort of part of my theme today. So there's no monolithic humanity, no single history of the human species or human peoples. And regarding the history of ecopsychology, nobody owns the field, so there's no sort of single correct history of it. But what we can say, is that it emerged as a self-identified field, recently as this kind of mostly Western phenomena with a certain kind of visible cast of characters. So that gives us the starting point in any case. So what I'm going to do today is a bit of an odd mix. On the one hand, I want to convey, this history of this self-defined ecopsychology, as it might kind of tell the story to itself, which is, I think that's important to know, and many people just don't know, where this field came from, even in this more sort of limited sense. and how it's evolved. So I do want to get that. But on the other hand, I want to introduce some, additional dimensions in order to help open up this idea that we could tell the history otherwise. And so maybe develop the field in additional ways that are more adequate to this, fiery moment in history that we're currently living through. So I'm going to use some slides to do this. So I'm going to share my screen here. Tried this with Carol earlier and it did work. So here we are. All right. So very brief account. I say very brief because, very limited time and a lot of ground to kind of cover. But I'm also, it's this history of ecopsychology, but it's also a history of what I'm calling the withdrawal of the human or the Western psyche from the world. I'm calling it this history as well because this withdrawing of the mind from the natural world, this is the story of the alienation or historical separating of the mind from nature. And that's what ecopsychology as a field is a response to. So if we're going to overcome this alienation between mind and nature, then we have to know something about, where this alienation comes from in the first place. So let's see. So one of the specific challenges for ecopsychology is that it emphasizes psychological processes at play in historical changes in the relationship between humans and nature. But this is not the way history is normally told. But Paul Shepard was a human ecologist. He's kind of a proto-ecopsychologist. He had a chapter in the original primer for the field in 1995. So he did indeed attempt what he called a psychohistory of how Western society has sort of broken its bond with the earth, starting with the agricultural revolution. So as he says here, in the ideology of farming, wild things are enemies of the tame. The wild other is not the context, but the opponent of my domain. Impulses, fears, and dreams, the realm of the unconscious, no longer are represented by the community of wild things with which I can work out a meaningful relationship. The unconscious is driven deeper and away with the wilderness. So that was 1982 from his book, Nature and Madness. So it really sets up this idea of the wild of the tame as the sort of the original split. And, he's not alone in this view. Timothy Morton, who's a leading environmental humanities scholar these days, he recently introduced the term the severing to refer to this Neolithic trauma that he says we continue to kind of reenact or play out this trauma to this day. So, those ideas are out there. And a related view comes from Murray Bookchin, who he developed a political approach called social ecology. So his idea is that there's this original, he calls it organic society, and this breaks down as surpluses develop and social hierarchies develop, and then along comes patriarchy and economic classes and state structures, gerontocracy, split between town and country. All these divisions get underway as organic society breaks down, and then these hierarchies develop, all these binaries of, one side of the binary being superior to the other, men over women and so on. And these hierarchies then provide the model for the human/nature hierarchy, which alienates us from nature. And what everyone thinks of Bookchin's specific ideas, he's a very controversial character. They can be taken as a marker for the more general idea that the histories of intersecting social oppressions or categories of difference in society have been complexly intertwined with histories of ecological destruction and alienation. In other words, it's not just a matter of a singular homogeneous society versus nature. And that's normally the way we talk about it. Human society, humans are messing up the natural world. But this complexifies that kind of idea, because it's really more a matter of various internally divided human societies with their ruling elites or privileged groups holding most of the power over people's relationships with the more than human world. So this is a way of looking at things that I think is very important as we tell this history. David Abram, highly influential figure in ecopsychology, so we have to talk about him. His work's been focused largely on this sort of historical shift between orality and literacy, with it this profound withdrawing of the psyche away from the surrounding world and into the confines of the human mind, along with this corresponding deadening of our bodily and sensory life and our perception of the wild world. So oral indigenous cultures have this sensuous, profoundly embodied mode of consciousness. This is sort of Abram's thinking, in which all spoken utterances take their meaning from or refer to the earthly beings, and in which stories that are tied to the land hold the culture's memory. So alphabetic literacy, ABC, this establishes a new reflective relationship between humans and their own signs. These texts, and this short circuits the sensory reciprocity between humans and the land, and engenders this detached, abstract mode of consciousness, which opens this gap between mind and nature, and then nature kind of falls silent and mute and distant. So that's Abram's take on history in a way, how history is a process of as an ecopsychological process. So now we come to this moment in history, which is sort of 16th century, this Mona Lisa painted by Leonardo da Vinci. The reason I'm throwing this picture up is the psychiatrist J.H. Vandenberg, he said one of the reasons this painting is so famous is because it depicts nature as the Middle Ages didn't know it. This was kind of a shocking new kind of painting. It's not just that smile, it's also that background. And that we're seeing nature in this very exterior way that it hadn't been seen before, with this corresponding interiorization, that enigmatic smile of the Mona Lisa. According to Vandenberg, this was a whole new way of experiencing the world, this nature now in the background and exterior, and the human psyche sort of more mysteriously interior. And it was this increasing interiorization of reality that some have suggested gave rise to psychology itself. So the term psychology is used for the first time in the 16th century by a variety of people, including Melanchthon, who was a friend of Martin Luther's, as the Reformation was happening. And here's Vandenberg. It says, modern psychology became possible because of an interiorization of all human realities. And then with Freud in the 20th century, this interiorization reached a point where all these internal conflicts gave rise to what became known as psychoanalysis. So, all cultures practice some form of psychology, but there was certainly something going on in the 16th century, 16th century Europe, that promoted this, new scholarly exercise of psychology. And some people like, Ken Wilber, for those who are familiar with him, say, this is a good thing. This interiorization is a good thing because it signifies a kind of evolution of consciousness or spirit, even as it might, cut people off in some ways that need to be compensated for. And so, Wilber is actually called ecopsychology regressive and romantic, and for not seeing, these processes as a good thing. So these kind of criticisms are also part of the territory for ecopsychologists. And another thing going on around the time of the Mona Lisa was the witch persecutions. So this is an attack on the old earth-based religions and traditions that saw the natural world or cosmos as alive and sacred. So it's an attack on women, the female being equated with nature. and any kind of communion with nature as kind of devil worship. So this helped clear the way for capitalism and the modern scientific view of nature as soulless matter to be dominated. Environmental historian Carolyn Merchant has wrote a book called The Death of Nature, which tracks this process. But as the feminist scholar Silvia Federici has noted, you know, the witch hunts weren't strictly a religious phenomenon, but were more of an attack against modes of relating to nature that were incompatible with the capitalist mode of production that was emerging at that time. So capitalism is a system that insists on a cleavage from and a domination of nature, including the human body. So as Federici has documented, you know, historically, whenever capitalist social relations are being imposed, the process typically starts with witch hunts, which is why witch persecutions are still taking place today in places like many African nations, as well as places such as India, Nepal, Saudi Arabia, Papua New Guinea. You know, as the capitalist order gets more sort of intensely introduced in these places, you know, here come the witch hunts, the witch persecutions. So, you know, as with Bookchin, the more general point here is that human alienation from nature takes place not just because of changes in philosophy or cultural practices. You know, often we tell this history as a history of ideas, but it's you know, more directly about this process of force or violence that's been at play. And again, this is part of what I like to underscore as we think about a next generation of ecopsychology. So here's an image from, for the modern, whoops, where am I in my notes? Right, so to give you another visual for the changes happening in early modern Europe, this is an image of how the body was, you know, imagined in the Middle Ages as an organic phenomenon with blood vessels here depicted as twigs. And, you know, here's another image a little later for the modern mechanical conception of the body, with a peasant now depicted as a machine that is simply a means of production for the accumulation of capital in this new economic system. So tracking different ideas about humans and nature based on the mode of production that is developing at the time. So this gives us a sense as well for the connection between the domination of human nature and the domination of the more than human natural world, when nature as a whole, including us, gets mechanized or imagined in these ways. And this is like sort of social media of the day, these images floating around. So this is what's informing the imaginary of the day. So, so as capitalism arose, philosophers and scientists such as Galileo and René Descartes, you know, they built ideas that supported this new ruling system. A lot of people think they're just philosophers doing their philosophy. They're doing their philosophy, but their philosophy was very tied to, you know, the emerging capitalist system. So Galileo, you know, his idea was that only the measurable properties of nature, their size, the shape, the mass, are real, while our, you know, so-called subjective experience consists of what he called secondary qualities like color and touch and taste. So in this way, nature is getting defined in a way that excludes our human experience from it. So again, this rift that's forming between humans and nature because of the totality of the ideas and systems that are operating at the time. And then Descartes' you know, famous dualism of mind and dead matter. So animals and our own bodies are these kind of just soulless machines. So the price of modern science's mechanical view of reality is what's often been called a sort of disenchantment of the world, or a de-animation, or a despiritualization of the world, what Carolyn Merchant called the death of nature. So what we might say is that modern psychology was actually born with the death of nature. And this makes ecopsychology a field that is trying to reverse the alienation from nature that gave rise to modern psychology itself. Particular way of sort of reading history. So, so thinking a little more about this capitalist colonial system in the history of the relationship between humans and nature, this fellow James O'Connor, he's an ecological socialist. I like what he says because he's saying these dualistic notions, splits between mind and body, mind and nature, subject and object, all these kind of dualistic notions, he says they were caused by and helped to cause real material and social changes. They're not just ideas, such as the breakup or enclosure of common lands and common property, the famous enclosures, New World slavery, all of these things involving real separation of nature or land and human beings. This forcible change violently divided human from non-human nature, helping transform the land into a commodity. So, as O'Connor suggests, a history of ideas just isn't enough if we're going to understand how ideas, including dualistic ones, are formulated in the context of specific economic, political, material realities, including those of the new nature-dominating capitalist colonial order that emerged as the feudal order collapsed. And as the second bullet here says, the violent removal, erasure, and clearance of indigenous peoples from their lands with settler colonialism is not just a one-time event. A lot of people kind of think, well, there's a history of colonialism, but we're past that now. So Patrick Wolf, an anthropologist, he described colonialism as a structure rather than as an event to sort of describe the way that this is something that isn't in the past. The word coloniality is also a term that's used for that, this ongoingness of colonialism. And right now I live in Canada, and there's just actions all over the country right now of indigenous peoples resisting the ongoing colonialism. You just have to turn on the news and it's right there. So we're very live with this stuff. It's not in the past, and it's very visible, which is again makes for a certain moment in history that I think psychology needs to be responding to. So I'm going to end the first part of my talk there, which hopefully gives us a bit of a sort of historical context for now turning to the history of ecopsychology itself. So again, I'm going to be very brief because there's a lot to cover and there's going to be lots of gaps. But what I want to just try to do is give a sort of general arc for the thing, and that gives us at least a bit of a sense of where this has all come from and maybe where it's going. So thinking way back, this is an Upper Paleolithic painting of a bison from the Altamira cave in Spain. And is this a kind of ecopsychology? It does appear to express the relationship between humans and a world that at the time was really thick with megafauna. And we obviously wouldn't call it psychology in the way that we think of that word today, but it's certainly a form of symbolizing, experience of the wild world. So it's sort of noteworthy in that way. Okay, so yeah, is cave art a kind of ecopsychology? Traditional ecological knowledge, this refers to this kind of profoundly holistic knowledge that developed by indigenous peoples over, countless generations in a particular place. That includes ethical dimensions about kinship and reciprocity with other than human beings, medicinal and spiritual understandings, principles for community governance. It's got a wholeness to it as a way of a form of knowledge that is really very foreign for someone living in a modern settler colonial kind of condition. But historically, this has been, for an indigenous community, is really the true wealth. Not, wealth isn't measured material, it's in terms of these profound knowledge systems. So while the existence of such knowledge, well predates modern science, there are many Indigenous scholars and activists today arguing that it's precisely this kind of knowledge that needs to be foundational for any kind of sort of reconciliation with the earth and with Indigenous peoples. And that second term there, European Indigenous knowledge, that comes from Peggy Ayres, who we'll meet again in a moment. And she really argues for kind of rediscovering European Indigenous knowledge, likewise as a basis for ecopsychology for people with European ancestry. Okay, Rousseau, one of the first people in the modern circles to sort of explicitly promote the value of wild nature. So is he a kind of ecopsychology? So as the mind is withdrawing from nature, suddenly nature kind of appears, and then it's something you can kind of value. And Rousseau was one of those first in sort of modern Europe to engage in that kind of process. Although Leopold, an ecologist, famous in ecological circles for the land ethic and for describing humans as mere members of the biotic community. But Leopold's also known for having made racist comments. So this is the kind of accounting or reckoning with racism in the history of the environmental movement is now also part of the process of history telling that we have to engage in. So all of these things on this slide, they predate the modern environmental movement, but the point is that they all have sort of significance for tracking, what ecopsychology is all about. So now as we move into the modern environmental era, we haven't come to ecopsychology as a self-defined field yet. We're talking about the sort of prehistory. But as we come into the modern environmental era, there's this sort of new rise of ecological consciousness and the development of many other perspectives that likewise can be seen as part of the prehistory as it gathers toward becoming a self-defined field. So this is just kind of a sampling of people. We're in the 1960s, 1970s here. Harold S. Searles is a psychiatrist, wrote a book called The Non-Human Environment. The full title is The Non-Human Environment in Normal Development and in Schizophrenia. And we'll get to a quote from him in a moment, but that was 1960. And then Rachel Carson famously wrote Silent Spring, which was very much part of the start of the modern environmental movement, 1962. But this book she wrote, The Sense of Wonder, it came out after she died, but she'd been working on it in the 50s. Just a beautiful book, about her relationship with a nephew and mentoring him into a relationship with the natural world. And there's a lot in Rachel Carson's writing that is relevant for ecopsychology and the nature connection movement. Paul Shepard, we'll get to another quote by him in a moment, but he was a human ecologist, and human ecology studies the human organism, and you can have bat ecology or forest ecology. What's human ecology? And he says the central question of human ecology is the relationship between the mind and nature. So he was saying that in the late 60s. Because of how much the psychological mediation of that relationship is a part of what it means to think of the human organism in relationship with the natural environment. Robert Greenway, in 1963, he started using the term psychoecology, and he was a bit of an unconventional kind of psychology prof. He would take his students on these very extended trips out into the wilderness, but he was trying to find a language, that could unify ecology and psychology. So for him, it was a lot about trying to find this language that would actually integrate these two things. And then Gregory Bateson, an anthropologist, a collection of his writings called Steps to Ecology of Mind was released in the 1970s. And he had this idea that what defines mind is the movement of information through systems. So he was part of, drawing on the cybernetic thinking of the time. so that the human mind is just part of this larger, what he called an eco-mental system. And so he was very much trying to unite mind and nature through the flows of information. And then he would say things like, you know, and if we want to dump all our pollutions and pollutants into Lake Erie, then we're going to drive Lake Erie insane. You know, so that's the kind of language he was using. And you know, and Lake Erie, we're still driving Lake Erie insane. You know, it's just full of algal blooms from all this phosphorus pollution and full of microplastics. And so, again, a lot of these ideas have currency. So here's Harold Searles, who we met a moment ago. He says, for psychology and psychiatry, the non-human environment has been considered as irrelevant to human personality development and to the development of psychiatric illness, as though human life were lived out in a vacuum, as though the human race were alone in the universe, pursuing individual and collective destinies in a homogeneous matrix of nothingness. So that's somebody in 1960 saying, you know, we're developing psychology in a way as if, you know, we could be on Mars. You know, there's just no reference or very little to the non-human environment, what he called the non-human environment. So that's, you know, I would have to think that's part of the prehistory of the field. Paul Shepard, if the environmental crisis signifies a crippled state of consciousness as much as it does damage habitat, then that is perhaps where we should begin, 1973. Okay, so a few more points and then we'll get to ecopsychology itself. So Gary Snyder, poet, very loved in the deep ecology movement. And so his poetry was considered, you know, very much part of the groundswell that gave rise to ecopsychology, poetic descriptions of the intertwining of mind and nature. But, you know, Snyder's been accused by some indigenous authors, such as Leslie Marmon Silko, of cultural appropriation. You know, here he's using the term Turtle Island for, you know, the title of his book. So this is another instance of this kind of reckoning with some of our history that's going on these days. The idea of the ecological self that comes from deep ecology, the idea of not just identifying with a human self, but part of the larger wild world, like John Seed, who says, you know, famously, you know, I'm the rainforest defending itself. So he's got this widespread sort of identification with the rainforest, and then you're acting from that larger sense of self. So these are, you know, psychological ideas within the ecology movement. So that's obviously relevant. Joanna Macy's work originally was called Despair and Empowerment, because what she found was that you bring people together, and rather than avoiding your despair, you go right at it, turn toward it. And, you know, this is a Buddhist practice. You turn toward the suffering, and then it transforms, and then it's an empowering process. You know, she's had a tremendous impact on ecopsychology, and a lot of her ideas, including about the need to have a spiritual practice that holds the earth sacred. If we're going to, you know, face, you know, the times we're in, you know, it's just so hard to do unless you're sort of grounded in that way. And then ecofeminism, another strand in the prehistory of ecopsychology, including, you know, goddess spirituality, where, you know, the earth is regarded as a goddess, and drawing on Wiccan traditions and all these ways of, again, integrating mind and nature through these spiritual practices, and other modes of ecofeminism as well. Okay, so just a few more things. Environmental justice. Carl Anthony has been an important figure in ecopsychology. So environmental racism has been his focus. You know, I mention it here both because of, you know, Carl Anthony's having been a significant voice in the field, but also because environmental justice links ecology and society, which is a key move, I think, in developing this third generation of ecopsychology, bringing more of this social justice dimension in. Environmental education, another sort of major stream that fed into the development of ecopsychology. People like Michael Cohen, for a long time has been developing nature connection processes. David Sobel, who's a educator who's done a lot to sort of rework developmental psychology to talk about children's need for sort of wild places and bonding with the earth. And John Young, major figure in the nature connection movement. David Kidner wrote an article called "Why Psychology is Mute About the Environmental Crisis." And, you know, I always think of him as one of the, he's kept a little distance from ecopsychology, but certainly that article was, at the time, you know, was certainly being circulated. And I think it was about 1994 that article came out. And he was really arguing how psychology, you know, thinks of distress purely in this kind of human way, and then the environmental crisis is totally something else. And so there's been this split, and he was really naming that at the time in a way that was very helpful. Bioregionalism, another movement, is practice of you know, in politics of living very intimately with one's bioregion or place on Earth, and really developing a mind for that place. And so again, that was part of what was feeding into the development of ecopsychology. Okay, so I think with this next slide, yes, so now we come to actually, you know, ecopsychology becoming this sort of word and getting known in the world. And so this first wave I call the Roszak era, because Theodore Roszak's writings and leadership really heavily colored the field at the time. Although it was Mary Gomes and Alan Kanner who were hosting the conversations in the late 1980s, and which Roszak joined, you know, that really set this wave going. This was a very heady time for the field, with Roszak calling ecopsychology a new beginning for the environmental movement and a revolution in modern psychology. So, you know, there were really great hopes for the field at the time. And then I was doing, so these two books got published. The Voice of the Earth, that was a book Roszak wrote, and then the Ecopsychology Primer collection of writings, 1995, which became the sort of Bible of the field in the early days. And then I was doing my graduate work at the time. I started in 1990, and so was sort of following all of these developments. And I thought the challenges in getting the field off the ground were much greater than was being imagined by Roszak and others. Because the ecopsychology was really something very radical, I thought. I still do, even if this radicalness had not been, you know, fully clarified. So my work was about trying to help the field come to a more accurate characterization of itself, and to suggest some lesser known intellectual traditions that I thought were suited to the field and that could give it some scholarly legs. So my book came out in 2002, which is really just a scrubbed up version of my doctoral dissertation. And this is really what I'm still at, and this is why I'm promoting the third generation. It's really about trying to help the field, for me, come to a true expression of itself, a mature expression of itself. So then for much of the 2000s, ecopsychology went into something of a lull. It didn't really catch on as a movement. But then in 2009, there were two developments that gave the field some new ways forward. So the first was the inauguration of the Ecopsychology Journal and the introduction by its editor, Thomas Joseph Doherty, of the idea of a second generation. You know, and a second generation of ecopsychology that would have more sort of credibility within academic psychology. And then the second development was the publication of the book on ecotherapy, edited by Linda Bazell and Craig Chalquist, which they offered as a way to reinvigorate the field from the side of therapeutic psychology. And there were other developments at the time as well, such as the launch of the European Journal of Ecopsychology in 2010. Generally takes a more sort of first generation approach. But the second wave, you know, it did in fact give the field more of a presence in the world. And in some ways, we're still riding this wave, though, as I say, I would argue that a third wave is building, given the current sort of urgencies and rethinks that are happening right now. So my work, where am I on my notes? Okay, so this is from Thomas Doherty, his first editorial from the journal in 2009. A holistic ecopsychological perspective did not readily find a voice in mainstream and academic psychology and psychiatry. A mission of this new journal is to lay the foundations of a second-generation ecopsychology that honors its countercultural origins without being limited by them, accepts that one can work within the system while also challenging the status quo, and recognizes that tending data sets and tending souls are not mutually exclusive. So that was Doherty's position. And then Patricia Hasbash and Peter Kahn, they edited a collection of writings in a book that promoted their own version of the second generation of ecopsychology. And Kahn's currently the editor-in-chief of the journal. And he's pushed for more conventional scientific psychology in the field, but he also is, makes a space for sort of what he would call more first generational, or he frames it as sort of countercultural ecopsychology. So this is Kahn and Hasbach's idea that our species always had a kinship with the other, with a greater than human world. This form of kinship, which is what we mean by our totemic self, allowed us to become and flourish as humans. Thus, one of the world's central challenges over the next 50 years is to embrace our totemic selves and to integrate that with our scientific culture and our technological selves. So that's their revision of ecopsychology, the sort of heart of what they were about. So part of the problem for the field of ecopsychology is how to differentiate or situate it relative to other forms of psychology that look at the human nature relationship. So environmental psychology emerged in the early 1960s, founded a journal in 1981. Studies the effects of the natural and built environment on human experience and behavior with an early focus on the built environment, noise pollution and dysfunctional office environments, stuff like that. But its methods are very conventional. So conventional empiricism, I just, pulled an article to give you an example. So moderating effects of social value orientation on determinants of pro-environmental behavior intention. So that's the kind of language they use. Give you just sort of a bit of a flavor for environmental psychology. And then conservation psychology, this appeared after ecopsychology. And it's a parallel to conservation biology and sets itself up not as a subdiscipline of psychology, as with environmental psychology, but a focus or a field that cuts across all of psychology with a conservation focus. So any psychologist can call themselves a conservation psychologist. Any psychologist can call themselves a conservation psychologist if you've got that focus. But it generally keeps its distance from ecopsychology, wanting to maintain an identity as conventional scientific psychology. And Kahn and Hasbach, they've argued that both environmental psychology and conservation psychology come under the umbrella of ecopsychology as they now define it. So it's all sort of, what's the master term here, and who's holding the umbrella. But the question keeps coming around about what differentiates ecopsychology from other approaches. And I have my own views. I been having these debates with Kahn and Doherty for a little while now, and the third generation is my way, in a sense of sort of moving on from these debates, because I think they've been pretty fruitless. But here's Doherty actually talking, in the sort of early days of the journal about okay, what makes for ecopsychology. He said, in many ways, ecopsychology has served as a container for what goes missing or under-recognized in the anonymous, at arm's length nature of the scientific enterprise. Emotion, personal meaning and transcendence, mystery, mysticism, despair and empowerment, critiques of the status quo, and ecocentric visions for a different society altogether. So, that certainly has some truth to it, and I think that's important to flag, that ecopsychology has been about sort of experiences that are lying on the margins and don't quite fit in with the conventional scientific way of doing things. And here's another perspective from Robert Greenway. So he says, I've argued for many, many years that ecopsychology is not just another psychology, but most of the people interested in ecopsychology are either therapists or psychologists. So they're always trying to claim ecopsychology as a kind of psychology. I've always tried to resist that because I think it's something unique. So, another perspective, and like Greenway argues, as do I, that the field's been over-identified with psychology, and it needs to be something more of a creative synthesis, more of a transformation, and creating something new that we don't just categorize in the same old way as a kind of psychology, which then falls into conventional ways of thinking about it. So now we come to this topic of ecopsychology and indigenous peoples, which has recently prompted some important rethinking in the field. This has always been a source of tension in ecopsychology. Back in '92, Rozak was talking about Stone Age psychiatry as a way of sort of identifying forms of tribal therapy or traditional medicine that were precursors of ecopsychology. And ecopsychology has been accused of romanticizing indigenous peoples. But a more sort of critical stance hasn't really come to the fore until recently, especially with the Jones and Siegel article in 2018, which challenged the field to examine how it reproduces and reinforces settler colonialism. There's also Peggy Ayer's book, An Activism on this topic, Ancient Spirit Rising, which aims to sort of reject empire and counter the appropriation, counter forms of cultural appropriation, such as white shamanism, while also finding ways to reclaim sort of authentic forms of Earth community. I'll mention the ecopsychologist Garrett Barnwell in South Africa. He's actively engaged with the history of colonialism there. And there was also a special issue of the Ecopsychology Journal on this topic of decolonization, which I myself had an article in. So all of this is part of what I see as building toward a third generation of ecopsychology. And so that's the note, I'll end on here with this final slide. So regarding this first point, the history of the human-nature relationship is a history of injustice, as I've tried to convey earlier. So for me, the third generation has to incorporate a justice orientation. So, ecopsychology is about the relationship between, psyche and the land, but this relationship, it has a history, which is largely one of social injustice. So the land just doesn't kind of just arrive out of a kind of social vacuum. And in fact, the land back movement is precisely about returning lands that have been stolen from indigenous peoples. So again, a very kind of current, there are very current developments that I think make for this moment. And, my simple way of talking about ecopsychology, I have three main terms, and I use a triangle to sort of map those three. So psyche and nature are the two familiar terms, but then society is this third term that I add. And so in any phenomenon, all those three dimensions or moments will be present. And for me, the third generation is about adding this society dimension, which doesn't take away all the good stuff that, the first and second generations have developed by focusing mostly just on psyche and nature, but it does complexify or deepen the whole project. And it really unsettles those first two generations in many, many ways. So society is where, we join up with history. So if ecopsychology is going to have any historical importance, for me, this is the direction we have to go as a field. So topics of colonialism, white supremacy, and other areas of social injustice are increasingly informing conversations about ecopsychology, certainly on social media. And so part of the move here as a field, I think, is toward these kind of missing histories. You know, Carl Anthony, who was had a very important chapter in the original primer from 1995. I mean, this was his point back then, way back in 1995, that there's all these stories that we're not telling because the field's so Eurocentric. And Janine Canty, a prophet in Europa University, you know, for a long time, she's been arguing for more social justice and multicultural content in ecopsychology. So there are all these other stories of environmental racism and resistances, non-Western cultures, stories of coloniality and decoloniality, more women-centered stories, including the witch persecutions. All these histories haven't been told. And if we were to tell the histories, you know, currently, then that makes for a different kind of prehistory, makes so the whole process of history telling is very fluid this way, I think. You know, I included environmental justice as part of the prehistory of the field because Carl Anthony was in the field and he brings that environmental justice in, so that becomes part of the prehistory. But if in a third generation we bring in, if other people arrive with other stories, then that tells a different story of where this all comes from. So, and then Phoenix Smith, she's been a vocal presence as well on this. She talks about missing stories or literatures. And, I participated in an event with her a couple of months ago. And, you know, she was listing some of these missing stories, and she mentioned this book by Jared Manos, who was a drug dealer in New York City, who fled from that life out onto the Great Plains, only to discover that there was more violence on the prairies in the form of ecological devastation than he found in the inner city. And so he founded the Great Plains Restoration Council and has started a number of programs such as restoration, not incarceration, that are essentially ecotherapy programs using ecological restoration. And so Phoenix saying like, well, where's he? You know, why aren't we talking about ghetto plainsmen? And, you know, Phoenix is herself launching an organization in 2021 called the Alliance for Ecotherapy and Social Justice, which aims to co-create a liberation ecotherapy, which I think of as a third generation initiative. So this idea of missing histories and stories, you know, raises the questions of how else we might understand the prehistory and history of ecopsychology itself, and how we might develop the field and its subject matter differently, taking it to what I think is a more sort of mature or historically relevant place. So I will end on that note. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Andy. I'm going to end the recording right now.